April 15th, 1986. 2 o'clock in the morning. The Mediterranean night hangs heavy over Tripoli. The air is thick with the scent of salt and the cooling dust of the North African coast. Inside the command bunkers of the Libyan air defense network, the atmosphere is supposed to be one of absolute, impregnable security. This is not a ragtag militia guarding a border. This is one of the most sophisticated air defense environments on the planet outside of the Warsaw Pact. Soviet military advisors stand shoulder to shoulder with Libyan officers, their eyes scanning the glowing green sweeps of the P-12 and P-14 radar scopes. They call this network KARI. It is a dense, overlapping web of Soviet-supplied technology, SA-2, SA-3, and the lethal SA-5 Gammon missile systems. It is designed specifically to make the airspace above Libya a suicide zone for any intruder. For months, the tension has been ratcheting up. The United States Sixth Fleet is prowling the Mediterranean, a massive display of naval power sitting just north of the so-called Line of Death in the Gulf of Sidra. The Soviet advisors know the Americans are there. They can see the carrier groups on their long-range scanners. They know the flight schedules of the F-14 Tomcats and the A-6 intruders. They have calculated the launch cycles. They believe they understand the threat perfectly. If the Americans attack, it will come from the sea, it will come from the north, and it will be a swarm of naval aircraft trying to punch through the coastal wall. The radar operators are relaxed. The scopes show the American fleet is operating as expected, distant, holding pattern, posturing. There is no surge in activity, no massive launch signatures associated with an alpha strike. The night is quiet. Then, the world ends. It does not begin with a blip on a radar screen. It begins with a sound that defies logic. A tearing, screaming roar that seems to materialize out of the vacuum of the night sky, directly overhead. Before a single alarm can be fully sounded, the ground shakes with a violence that registers on seismographs hundreds of miles away. The Bab al-Azizia compound, the heavily fortified nerve center of the Libyan regime and the personal residence of Colonel Gaddafi, erupts into a firestorm. Inside the bunker, panic is immediate and total. "Contact! Where is the contact?" a Libyan officer screams, smashing his hand against the console. The Soviet advisors push forward, squinting at the screens. The radar is washing out. The clean, rhythmic sweeps are suddenly filled with snow, massive electronic jamming that blinds the sensors. But through the static they see fleeting ghosts. Fast movers. Low. Incredibly low. "They are under the floor," a technician yells. 200 feet! They are flying at 200 feet! This is the first impossibility. To fly high-performance jet aircraft at 200 feet at night, in total darkness, requires a level of technological proficiency that borders on magic. But it is the direction that freezes the blood of the Soviet observers. The reports flooding in from the observation posts are not coming from the north, where the American carriers are sitting. The thunder is rolling in from the west. This makes no sense. To the west lies Tunisia, Algeria, the vast expanse of the Atlantic. There are no American bases there. The European nations, France, Spain, Italy, have all publicly refused to grant the United States airspace for a strike against Libya. The diplomatic channels are closed. The airspace is locked. For American aircraft to be striking from the west, they would have had to fly a route that is logistically impossible for tactical fighters. It would require a detour of thousands of miles, a flight duration that exceeds the endurance of a standard combat loadout by a factor of 3 or 4. If you enjoy unraveling the hidden mechanics of history's most intense standoffs, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We investigate the declassified files and the forgotten tech that defined the 20th century. Back in the bunker, the confusion deepens into terror. The jamming is relentless. The specific frequency hopping indicates the presence of the F-111 Raven, a sophisticated electronic warfare platform. But the birds dropping the ordnance? They are heavy. The acoustic signature is different from the light naval fighters like the F-18 Hornet. These are engines with massive bypass ratios, engines that sound like freight trains in the sky. Another report comes in over the chaotic radio net. The Jamahiriya barracks is burning. The Murat Sidi Bilal training camp is under attack. The Benina airfield, hundreds of miles to the east in Benghazi, is simultaneously being pounded. The coordination is terrifying. Targets separated by vast distances are being hit within seconds of each other. A Soviet advisor grabs a telephone, trying to reach the flight line at Mitiga Air Base. "Scramble the interceptors. Get the MiG-25 aircraft in the air now." But it is too late. The runway at Mitiga is already cratered. The hangars housing the gleaming Soviet-built MiG-23 aircraft are being turned into twisted metal by laser-guided munitions that seem to thread the needle through the darkness. The Soviet advisors are paralyzed by a single gnawing question. They know the capabilities of the US Navy. The A-6 Intruder is a capable bomber, but to coordinate a strike of this magnitude, hitting Tripoli and Benghazi simultaneously with this specific approach vector implies a completely different kind of beast. The aircraft tearing up the sky above Tripoli are not behaving like carrier jets. They are too fast on the deck. They are carrying too much heavy ordnance. And they came from the wrong side of the map. As the anti-aircraft guns finally open up, sending streams of red tracers blindly into the black sky, the radar finally catches a hard lock on one of the retreating attackers. The speed readout flickers. Mach 1.2. At sea level. The advisor stares at the number. No naval aircraft carries a heavy bomb load at supersonic speeds on the deck after a mission of unknown length. What is that? The Libyan officer whispers, watching the blip race away toward the dark Mediterranean, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. I do not know, the Soviet replies, his voice grim. But they are not from the aircraft carriers. They have flown from somewhere else. Somewhere they should not be. The impossible strike has occurred. The line of death was ignored. The sophisticated Soviet air defense network was not just defeated, it was ignored until the bombs were already falling. As the fires burn across Tripoli, turning the night sky an angry orange, the investigation begins. The Soviets need to know how the Americans did this. How did they move an air force halfway around the world, bypass the entire European continent, strike with surgical precision in total darkness, and vanish before the MiG-21 aircraft could even turn their engines over? The answer lies in a plan that was audaciously risky, a machine that was misunderstood by the world, and a group of pilots who had been sitting in cockpits for nearly 14 hours before they even dropped a bomb. The sun rises over Tripoli on April 15th, revealing the jagged scars of the night. Smoke columns stand like black pillars against the morning sky, marking the precise locations of the Bab al-Azizia compound and the terrified neighborhood surrounding it. In a secure room within the Soviet embassy, far removed from the smoldering craters, a different kind of excavation is taking place. This is not about rescuing survivors, it is about rescuing logic. The GRU Soviet military intelligence is staring at a large map of the European theater, and the math simply refuses to balance. The initial assumption was a carrier strike. The USS America and the USS Coral Sea are in the region. It would be the standard American play. Launch A-6 Intruders and F-18 Hornets from the deck, punch a hole, drop the payload, and recover. It is a tactical equation the Soviets have solved 1,000 times in war games. But the debris recovered from the streets of Tripoli tells a different story. And the radar tapes, now being replayed in agonizing slow motion, reveal a flight profile that no carrier aircraft could execute. The radar tracks show the attackers hitting the coast at over 500 miles per hour, under the radar horizon, and then accelerating. Carrier jets are light, agile, designed for short, sharp punches. The acoustic analysis of the engine roar, that deep, earth-shaking thrum reported by survivors, suggests something much heavier. These were not light fighters. These were interdictors, heavy haulers. The Soviet analysts pinpoint the likely culprit, the General Dynamics F-111 aardvark. They know this machine. They fear this machine. It is the rough equivalent of their own Su-24 Fencer, a variable sweep wing bomber designed to fly low and fast, hugging the curvature of the Earth to deliver nuclear or conventional payloads. It is a Cold War bogeyman, a plane built specifically to penetrate the dense air defense networks of the Warsaw Pact in Central Europe. But knowing what hit them only makes the how more baffling. The only F-111 bombers in the European theatre are stationed in England at RAF Lakenheath. An analyst traces a line from Lakenheath to Tripoli with a grease pencil. It is a straight shot south, cutting directly across France and Spain, a distance of roughly 1,300 miles. A long flight certainly, but manageable with a single mid-air refueling. However, the diplomatic cables arriving from Paris and Madrid shatter this theory. Both France and Spain have explicitly denied the United States permission to use their airspace for this strike. The airspace over continental Europe was a closed door. The straight shot did not exist. The room goes quiet as the implications sink in. If the Americans could not fly over Europe, they had to fly around it. The analyst takes the pencil and draws a new line. It starts in England, goes west out into the Atlantic Ocean, hooks south around the Bay of Biscay, squeezes through the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, avoiding Spanish and Portuguese airspace, and then runs the entire length of the North African coast to turn south into Libya. That is impossible, a senior officer mutters. The new line is not 1,300 miles. It is nearly 3,000 miles. One way. A round trip of 6,000 miles. For a strategic bomber like the B-52, this is a Tuesday afternoon. But for a tactical fighter bomber, a cockpit the size of a family sedan, crammed with 2 men, strapped into ejection seats, this is not a mission. It is an endurance test that pushes the limits of human physiology and mechanical reliability. To fly a tactical jet from England to Libya via the Atlantic Loop is the logistical equivalent of driving a Formula One car from New York to Los Angeles without stopping the engine. The Soviets begin to calculate the fuel requirements. The F-111 is thirsty. At low altitude, its turbofans guzzle jet fuel at a staggering rate. To make this flight, the Americans would need an aerial refueling armada of unprecedented size. They would need to refuel not once, but 4 or 5 times, often in complete radio silence, often at night, often in turbulent weather over the open ocean. If just one refueling connection failed, the bomber would flame out and crash into the Atlantic. If the navigation drifted by a fraction of a degree, they would violate Spanish airspace and cause an international incident. And yet, the bombs fell on Tripoli. The Soviet advisors realized they are looking at a failure of imagination. They assumed the Americans were bound by the constraints of geography and diplomacy. They believed that because France closed the door, the hallway was blocked. They did not anticipate that the US Air Force would simply dismantle the wall. The investigation shifts focus. They need to understand the invisible fleet. The radar tapes in the wider Mediterranean are scrutinized. There were blips, ghosts drifting near the Azores, near Gibraltar. At the time, they were dismissed as commercial traffic or glitches. Now, they look like tankers. Dozens of KC-10 and KC-135 tankers, forming a literal bridge of fuel across the sky. This was not just a bombing run, it was a demonstration of global reach. The message being sent to Moscow is clear. There is no safe distance. We do not need forward bases. We do not need permission from allies. If we want to hit you, we can launch from our bedrooms and be at your doorstep by dinner. But as the Soviets marvel at the logistics, another mystery emerges from the wreckage analysis in Tripoli. The targeting. The bombs hit the barracks. They hit the airfield. But several bombs missed, and one F-111 is missing. Reports are coming in from the sea. A fireball was seen plunging into the water. The Americans lost a plane. The Soviets smell blood. The F-111 is a complex beast, known for its avionics and its automated terrain-following radar. If one went down, and if the wreckage can be recovered, the secrets of American low-level penetration technology, the very systems designed to defeat the Soviet Union, might be lying on the floor of the Mediterranean. The confusion over the route is settling into a cold realization of the threat. But now, the race is on for the technology. The Americans proved they could get there, but the cost was high. The impossible mission had a flaw, and the Soviets are determined to find it. While the Soviet analysts in Tripoli are drawing lines on maps, trying to comprehend the geometry of the attack, the reality of what occurred inside those cockpits is a story of human endurance that borders on torture. The Soviets see the F-111 as a machine, a collection of lift coefficients, radar cross-sections, and thrust ratios. But the invisible fleet that struck Tripoli was piloted by men who had been awake for 24 hours and strapped into a cramped ejection capsule for 13 of them. To understand why the Soviet radar was baffled, you have to understand the environment inside the cockpit of an F-111 Farads during Operation El Dorado Canyon. It is a claustrophobic aluminum tube glowing with the dim green light of CRT screens. The pilots, seated side by side, are encased in survival gear, G-suits, and life preservers. They are unable to stand. They are unable to stretch. For half a day, their entire world is the instrument panel and the refueling boom of the tanker ahead of them. The mission profile required absolute radio silence. This is what the Soviet signal intelligence units, usually so sharp at picking up American chatter, missed completely. There were no calls of fuel confirmed or waypoint reached. Imagine the tension. You are flying a heavy bomber over the pitch-black Atlantic Ocean. You are thousands of miles from home. You are running on fumes. To get the fuel you need, you have to guide your jet into a small basket trailing behind a KC-10 or KC-135 tanker, all while battling turbulence and fatigue. You do this not once but 4 times, in silence. A single missed connection, a broken fuel probe, or a sudden downdraft, and you are swimming in the freezing ocean while the rest of the strike force leaves you behind. This tanker bridge is the hidden miracle of the operation. It allowed the US Air Force to project power without landing gears ever touching the ground. But as the strike force turned the corner at Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean, the nature of the mission changed. They dropped the tankers. They dropped the altitude. This is the moment the Soviet air defense experts are obsessing over, the transition from high-altitude cruiser to low-level assassin. The F-111 has a secret weapon, a piece of technology that the Soviets are desperate to replicate. The terrain-following radar, or TFR. It is a system that demands blind faith. The pilot engages the system, sets a clearance altitude in this case, as low as 200 feet, and then takes his hands off the stick. The computer reads the terrain ahead, blasting radar waves into the darkness. If it sees a hill, it pulls the nose up. If it sees a valley, it pushes the nose down. To the pilots, it is terrifying. Rushing through the dark at 600 miles per hour, trusting a 1,980 seconds computer not to fly you into a cliff face. To the Soviet radar operators watching the scopes in Libya, it is a nightmare. As the phone 111 seconds approach the Libyan coast, they drop below the radar horizon. The Soviet-built sensors rely on line of sight. By hugging the waves, the American bombers effectively disappear from the screens. They become ghosts. But the final approach to Tripoli introduces a new chaos. The rules of engagement are strict. The Americans are not carpet bombing. They are hunting specific buildings within a crowded city. To do this, they have to use the PAVE-TAC system, a laser targeting pod belly-mounted on the aircraft. Here is the friction point. To use the laser, the plane has to pop up slightly, acquire the target on a grainy infrared screen, lock the laser, and release the massive 2,000-pound GBU-10 laser-guided bombs. It sounds surgical. In practice, it is messy. The pilots are exhausted. The anti-aircraft fire is blinding. The smoke from the first hits is obscuring the targets for the jets behind them. One F-111, call sign Karma 52, piloted by Captain Fernando Ribas, Dominici and Weapons System Officer Captain Paul Lawrence, is in the thick of it. They are part of the wave targeting the Azizia barracks. The Soviet advisors on the ground hear the roar of Karma 52. They see the flash of the detonation. But then, they see something else. A streak of fire plunging into the Gulf of Sidra. Karma 52 does not turn for home. The loss of the aircraft provides the Soviets with their only grim satisfaction of the night. The Americans are not invincible. They are bleeding. But as the sun climbs higher on the morning of the 15th, and the survivors of the long flight are already refueling over the Atlantic on their way back to England, the Soviets uncover the most disturbing detail of all. They analyze the bomb craters, they look at the destruction at the airfield and the barracks, and they realize that despite the fatigue, despite the impossible distance, and despite the wall of fire thrown up by the Libyan defenses, the Americans achieved a level of accuracy that should not be possible after a 6-hour flight. The Soviet military doctrine relies on mass. Send 100 planes, accept losses, carpet the grid square. The Americans sent a handful of planes, flew them the long way around the world, and dropped bombs down ventilation shafts. The Soviet generals in Moscow are reading the reports and realizing that their numerical advantage in Europe might not matter. If the Americans can strike with this kind of precision from bases outside the theater, the entire calculation of the Cold War has just shifted. But there is one final piece of the puzzle. The Soviets are looking at the jamming that blinded them. They are looking at the electronic warfare that allowed the phone 111 seconds to get that close in the first place. And they are about to realize that what they saw on their screens was not just snow, it was a deliberate, calculated illusion. The shock isn't just that the planes flew far. It is that the US didn't just defeat the radar, they seduced it. The smoke clears over Tripoli, but the fog of war inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus is only getting thicker. The physical damage is quantifiable craters, destroyed aircraft, ruined barracks. But the electronic damage is what keeps the GRU analysts awake at night. They return to the magnetic tapes of the radar data recorded during the attack. They are looking for the moment of failure. They expect to see the American bombers using brute force to jam the frequencies, a wall of noise to drown out the signal. But as they isolate the frequencies, they find something far more disturbing. The Libyan radar operators didn't just lose the targets. They were actively manipulated. The snow on the screens wasn't random static. It was a carefully conducting symphony of electrons. The reveal comes when an analyst overlays the flight paths of the bombers with a second, previously ignored set of flight paths. These aircraft didn't drop bombs. They didn't fly low to hug the terrain. They stayed high, orbiting just outside the lethal envelope of the SA-5 missiles. These were the F-111 Ravens. The Soviets know the airframe. It looks exactly like the F-111 bomber. But inside, there are no bombs. The weapons bay is packed with 3 tons of high-powered transmitters and receivers, the ALQ-99 tactical jamming system. The shock for the Soviets is the realization of how these Ravens were used. They didn't just blind the radar, they built an invisible corridor in the sky. As the strike force of bombers approached the line of death, the Ravens engaged their jammers, but they didn't jam everything. They focused their energy into narrow, high-power beams, targeting the specific search radars looking at the bomber's approach vector. They essentially carved a cone of silence through the Libyan defenses. Inside this electronic tunnel, the F-111 bombers were invisible. Outside of it, the radar worked perfectly, showing empty sky. The Libyan operators were looking at their screens, seeing clear air, believing they were safe. They had no idea that inside that slice of clear sky, 18 bombers were rushing towards them at supersonic speeds. But the American deception went deeper. This is the twist that truly humiliates the Soviet doctrine. While the Air Force Ravens were blinding the eyes of the defense, the US Navy was busy cutting out its tongue. The Soviet advisors realized that minutes before the bombs fell on Tripoli, the Libyan radar network lit up with ghost contacts coming from the sea. These were decoys. The US Navy launched drone aircraft and engaged in aggressive maneuvering with their A-7 and F-18 aircraft, deliberately trying to get the Libyans to turn on their engagement radars. In the world of air defense, this is called trolling. The moment a Libyan operator, panicked by the ghosts, flipped the switch to transmit to lock onto a target, they signed their own death warrant. High above, US Navy aircraft were carrying the AGM-88 HARM high-speed anti-radiation missile. These missiles don't need to see the target. They smell it. They lock onto the specific frequency of the enemy radar beam and ride it down to the source like a train on a track. The Soviet analysts watched the timeline in horror. 1:50 a.m. Libyan SA-5 site turns on to track a Navy decoy. 1:51 a.m. The SA-5 site ceases to exist, destroyed by a HARM missile. It was a trap. The Americans used the Soviet-designed integrated air defense system against itself. By integrating the radars to share data, the Libyans made the entire network vulnerable. The Americans baited them into revealing their locations, blinded the specific sectors where the real attack was coming from, and then systematically destroyed anyone who tried to look through the blinders. The baffling of the radar wasn't a technical glitch. It was a tactical masterpiece. The phone 111 seconds didn't just survive because they were fast or low. They survived because they were fighting a blind, deaf, and mute opponent. The only American aircraft lost Karma 52 likely fell not because the system worked, but because of the sheer chaos of flying at 200 feet in the dark while maneuvering to avoid the debris of the very defenses they were destroying. For the Soviet military, the implications are catastrophic. They have spent billions of rubles building the dense air defense model for the Warsaw Pact based on the assumption that overlapping radar coverage creates an impenetrable wall. Operation El Dorado Canyon proved that the wall is an illusion. Against a coordinated Western SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, and EW, electronic warfare, attack, the radar network is not a shield, it is a target. The phone 111 seconds flying thousands of miles was a feat of logistics, but the F-111 Ravens, creating a highway through the sky, was a feat of dominance. The Soviets are left with a chilling conclusion. We can see them only when they want us to see them. The bombs have stopped falling, but for the pilots of the F-111 bombers, the nightmare is only half over. They are leaving the chaos of Tripoli behind, turning north back toward the Mediterranean. The adrenaline spike that sustained them through the attack run is crashing. In its place comes a crushing narcotic fatigue. They have been in their cockpits for 7 hours. They have another 7 hours to go. This is the phase of the mission that the Soviet strategists found almost impossible to model in their war games. Combat effectiveness is usually measured in minutes over the target. But here, the effectiveness is measured in the sheer will to keep a 20-ton machine airborne while the body shuts down. The formation is ragged. They are short on fuel. One aircraft, call sign Karma 52, is not on the radio. The silence on the frequency where Captain Rebaz Dominici and Captain Lawrence should be checking in is heavy. It is a void that every other pilot feels. They rejoin the tanker fleet over the water. The refueling this time is not just a procedure, it is a lifeline. Some of the bombers are so low on fuel that their engines would flame out within minutes if the tankers were not exactly where they were supposed to be. It is a ballet of desperation played out at 20,000 feet. Back in England, the families of the pilots are waiting. The news is already breaking on the television. The world knows. When the wheels of the lead F-111 finally touch the runway at RAF Lakenheath, nearly 14 hours after they departed, the crews have to be physically lifted out of their capsules. They are cramped, dehydrated, and emotionally hollowed out. They have flown the equivalent of a round trip from New York to Moscow, fought a high-intensity war in the middle, and returned. For the Soviet Union, the safe return of the majority of this force is the final nail in the coffin of their strategic confidence. In the weeks following the raid, the Soviet military journals are surprisingly quiet about the specifics. There is plenty of propaganda condemning the imperialist aggression, but the technical analysis is classified, buried deep in the archives of the Ministry of Defense. Why? Because the truth is too damaging to admit. The El Dorado Canyon raid demonstrated that the Soviet Union's most valuable strategic asset, its geographic depth, was no longer a guarantee of safety. For decades, Russian military thinking relied on the idea that general winter and the vast distances of the Eurasian steppe would swallow any invader. But the F-111 proved that distance is irrelevant if you have the logistics to ignore it. The Americans didn't need a base in Turkey or Germany to hit a target. They could project power from an island in the North Sea to a desert in North Africa with surgical precision. This realization forces a massive shift in Soviet spending. They have to upgrade their radars. They have to develop new interceptors like the MiG-31 Foxhound to hunt cruise missiles and low-level bombers. They have to spend billions of rubles they do not have, chasing a threat that can come from any direction. The F-111 Aardvark, the plane that flew this mission, occupies a strange place in history. It was ugly. It was controversial. It was plagued by mechanical issues early in its life. But on that night in April 1986, it vindicated its existence. It was the ultimate Cold War machine, a specialized tool designed for a specific, terrifying purpose: to go alone, into the dark, under the radar, and deliver a message that no border could stop. The wreckage of Karma 52 would eventually be washed up and recovered. The Libyans would use it for propaganda. But the pilots, Ribas Dominici and Lawrence, would be remembered as the cost of proving a doctrine that likely prevented a larger war. By showing the Soviets that their defenses were porous, the balance of power held. Today, the F-111 is retired. Its role has been taken over by the F-15E Strike Eagle and the stealthy F-35 Lightning. The skies over Libya are quiet. But the lesson of that night remains etched in the history of aerial warfare. It was the moment the world learned that with enough fuel, enough tankers, and enough resolve, there is no such thing as out of range. The radar screens in Tripoli eventually went back to their rhythmic green sweeping, but the operators watching them would never look at the empty sky the same way again. They knew now that the most dangerous thing wasn't the blip they could see. It was the roar they couldn't hear until it was already too late.